Chapter 14, Lesson 1, King Cotton and the Spread of Slavery. So now we're moving into the Civil War period, which is obviously one of the most traumatic in our country's history, when the South tried to break away and form its own country, and the North was fighting to keep together the two parts. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this, but we're looking at kind of the roots of some of this stuff, primarily the economic stuff involving why the two sides were different. So let's get a move on. So there are two main different ways of life at this point. There's the northern way and the southern way, and these two are diverging. They're going further and further apart as the longer we go through. Farming, there's still most people in the north were farmers, but farming did become less important in the north, and manufacturing became more important. That's, if you remember that stuff about mill towns and stuff like that, that becomes more important during the Industrial Revolution period. Lots of immigrants were also coming from Northern Europe, particularly Germany and Ireland as well, and a lot of them settled in the cities. Now, in terms of the South, most of the Southerners were small farmers who did not have slaves. The vast majority were not slave owners. But cotton was produced on these large plantations, made a lot of money, and it was heavily reliant upon slaves. Some argued that hey, we're treating slaves better than those northern factory workers are treated, give them a place to stay and all that sort of stuff. Sounds like people justifying things to me, justifying treating people badly to me. And it was a choice on some level in the North for immigrants to come here, as opposed to in the South, where slaves were forced to work from basically when they were born until when they died. So I got to say that I think that that's not a very good point that some Southerners were arguing about. And in opposing slavery, it had gradually ended in the North over time. It just partially it wasn't profitable because they didn't need the massive amount of workers that they needed in the large-scale plantations. Slavery was made illegal in 1808 into the nation, but it did grow. Some people were still smuggled in. There's a famous case called the Armistead, where a group of slaves were being smuggled in, and then it turned out that actually they were their ship was taken over by the slaves, and the slaves were able to take control of it, but then they were captured and they were brought to the U.S. And there was a big court case, and it was determined eventually that they were free. So slavery, though, grew since some were still brought in illegally, and others were born into it. And again, if you were a slave owner and two slaves had a kid, then you had a new slave, which is kind of sick and twisted, but that's the way it was. Now, throughout history, there were slave rebellions. The most famous one was Nat Turner's rebellion, another one, Stono Rebellion. But Nat Turner's is the one that really freaked out in a lot of ways the Southerners more than any other. It was the most effective one in a lot of ways, and the most violent. It was halted after about 60 people were killed. You know, when I say 60 people, I mean 60 slave owners, whites, women, children, and just 60 of them were killed. The rebels were caught and eventually hung after basically there was a big publicity. But this here is the point of view of the white Southerners. You can see, oh, look at the horrible slaves attacking. And obviously this is not very accurate, but it's propaganda. But it led to a lot of fear among slave owners. And it led to more laws too, like even stricter, harsher things where you couldn't even speak out against slavery, which is a pretty big restriction on freedom. Frederick Douglass is probably the most well-known of the people who spoke out against slavery, and he was well-known partially because he was born as a slave and then escaped at around 20 years old. He disguised himself as a sailor, and he snuck aboard a boat and then made it up to Massachusetts, and he started lecturing about his experiences as a slave and became a really powerful advocate because he was such a wonderful speaker that it was hard to argue that, hey, you know what, slaves are not very bright or capable and they deserve to be in their position. If someone like Frederick Douglass could be around and speak so eloquently and powerfully. So definitely he was a powerful spokesperson. He actually published an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star as well. And there were some free African Americans in both the North and the South. Some had been born free, others were freed by their owners. Many lived in the North in cities. But there still was a lot of prejudice. They did not have the same rights as whites did. In the South, they had to carry around papers showing their status, had to obey different laws. Sometimes they had to pay extra taxes, had to register with the police, which is really kind of offensive again. In the North, they weren't able to go to public areas. So yes, the North was racist too, and prejudiced, again, judging people based on their skin color in this case. And in the North, so they weren't allowed to go to the same public areas that white people were. So they couldn't go to like concerts and things like that, buses, and one of the heroes of this early movement is a woman named Elizabeth Jennings, who was on her way to a religious service and she was late, so she jumped aboard a streetcar and was told that it was a whites-only streetcar, and she basically didn't put up with that and stayed on it, and eventually she was kicked off, pulled off, but she sued, and this is in New York in 1854, and her court case was taken up, and it was determined that it was illegal what had been done to her. She got a bunch of money for the time period, about $5,000 in today's money, and the new streetcars, which are these cars that were pulled by horses, they were determined to be you cannot be segregated on them soon afterwards. So you couldn't do it on the basis of race. Choose which passengers can be on board on the basis of race. That was a big deal, and again, you can sort of see in the future a woman named Rosa Parks who sort of a similar story on some level. Now, there were some neighborhoods, again, particularly churches were very important in the African American community, bound together a lot, and even on some level today you can see that in a lot of communities being sort of the bedrock of it. In the New York area, it was important for working to the end of slavery. They had some areas that were important, particularly an area called Weeksville and Seneca Village, also another area. But so they became leaders in the fight against slavery. In the South, there was an area that had been around really since the 1700s called Umbler. And that was in Virginia, where there was a free black community as well. So that's it.